The wind cuts across King William Island like a blade made of ice and darkness, carrying with it the screams of dying men that only the Arctic remembers. In this place, where the sun vanishes for 4 months, and temperatures plunge so low that exposed flesh freezes in seconds, 129 British sailors and officers met fates so horrific that Victorian England refused to believe the truth when it finally emerged decades later. This is the complete story of the Franklin expedition, not just a tale of ships trapped in ice, but a descent into madness, cannibalism, and the absolute limits of human endurance that began with champagne toasts in London's finest clubs and ended with men gnawing on the bones of their comrades in temperatures that froze their tears before they could fall. To understand how the pride of the British Navy ended up scattered across the Arctic in pieces, we must first understand the world that sent them there. In 1845, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun literally never set on British territories. British factories produced more goods than the rest of Europe combined. British ships dominated global trade. British banks financed the world's economy. In this atmosphere of seemingly limitless power and possibility, the one thing Britain hadn't conquered was the Arctic Ocean's Northwest Passage, a hypothetical route through the Canadian Arctic archipelago that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The Northwest Passage had obsessed European powers for 3 centuries. Whoever controlled it would have a massive commercial and military advantage, cutting thousands of miles off trade routes to Asia. Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and France had all tried and failed to find it. By the 1840s, Britain had mapped much of the Arctic archipelago through dozens of expeditions. Only about 300 miles of coastline remained unexplored. The Admiralty was confident that one more expedition, properly equipped and led, would complete the puzzle and claim this ultimate prize for Britain. Enter Sir John Franklin, a man whose entire life seemed to prepare him for either great triumph or spectacular disaster, with very little room in between. Born in 1786 in Spilsby, Lincolnshire, Franklin was the 9th of 12 children in a middle-class family. His father wanted him to become a clergyman, but young John was entranced by the sea. At age 14, he joined the Royal Navy as a first-class volunteer, beginning a career that would span wars, explorations, and ultimately, one of history's greatest maritime mysteries. Franklin's early career was distinguished but not exceptional. He fought at the Battle of Copenhagen under Nelson in 1801, where he showed courage under fire, but no particular genius for warfare. He served at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Britain's greatest naval victory, though in a minor role that won him no special recognition. It was in exploration, not warfare, that Franklin would make his name, though that name would become as synonymous with disaster as with discovery. His first Arctic expedition came in 1818 under Captain David Buchan, attempting to reach the North Pole via Spitsbergen. The expedition failed miserably, turned back by impenetrable pack ice, but Franklin acquired a taste for Arctic exploration that would define the rest of his life. The Arctic, he wrote to his sister, was terrible and beautiful beyond description, a place where man confronts both God and himself. Franklin's second Arctic expedition, which he commanded from 1819 to 1822, should have served as a warning about his leadership abilities in extreme conditions. Tasked with mapping the northern coast of Canada overland, Franklin's expedition was a catastrophe from start to finish. Poor planning, inadequate supplies, and Franklin's stubborn refusal to adopt indigenous survival techniques led to starvation conditions. 11 of his 20 men died. The survivors were reduced to eating lichen, which they called tripe de roche, and their own leather boots. Franklin himself survived by eating his own boots, earning him the nickname, the man who ate his boots, a name that followed him for the rest of his career, whispered mockingly by junior officers who thought him unfit for command. Yet somehow, this disaster made Franklin famous rather than infamous. He had survived, after all, and mapped 350 miles of coastline. Victorian society loved a good survival story, especially one involving gentlemanly behavior under extreme conditions. Franklin had maintained proper British decorum even while starving. He had continued to read prayers, maintain naval discipline, and write detailed observations. He became a hero, knighted by King George IV, celebrated in newspapers, invited to lecture at scientific societies. Franklin's third Arctic expedition from 1825 to 1827 was actually successful, mapping more of Canada's Arctic coast without major disasters. This success rehabilitated his reputation and made him the obvious choice for what everyone believed would be the final conquest of the Northwest Passage. Between expeditions, he served as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, from 1837 to 1843, where his administration was marked by humanitarian reforms, but also by conflicts with the Colonial Office that led to his recall, another warning sign of his inflexibility and poor judgment that was ignored in the enthusiasm for Arctic exploration. By 1845, Franklin was 59 years old, overweight, suffering from recurring influenza, and walked with a distinctive rolling gait that younger officers mocked. He was, by any objective measure, too old and unfit for Arctic command. But he had experience, reputation, and most importantly, social connections. His wife, Lady Jane Franklin, was a force of nature who lobbied relentlessly for his appointment. The Admiralty, perhaps reasoning that this final expedition would be more of a victory lap than a real challenge, gave him command. Lady Jane Franklin deserves her own examination, as she would become almost as famous as her husband, though for very different reasons. Born Jane Griffin in 1791, she was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, in an age when women were expected to be none of these things too obviously. She had traveled extensively, visiting places considered exotic and dangerous for women: Egypt, Syria, the Holy Land. She had climbed mountains, crossed deserts, and written detailed journals that revealed a sharp, observant mind. Her marriage to Franklin in 1828 was her second. Her first husband had died, leaving her wealthy and independent. Jane Franklin understood the value of publicity and social manipulation in ways her husband never did. While Franklin prepared his ships and crews, Jane worked London society like a master conductor leading an orchestra. She hosted elaborate dinners for Admiralty officials, their wives, and influential journalists. She cultivated friendships with the wives of cabinet ministers. She arranged for favorable coverage in newspapers, ensuring that her husband's expedition would launch with maximum public attention and support. She even commissioned a silk Union Jack for Franklin to plant at the completion of the Northwest Passage, a flag that would never be planted but would become one of the many poignant symbols of the expedition's failure. The ships chosen for the expedition were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and their names would prove prophetically appropriate. Both were bomb vessels, originally designed to bombard shore targets with massive mortars. This design made them incredibly strong, with reinforced hulls capable of withstanding the recoil of heavy weapons. For Arctic service, they had been further reinforced with extra layers of English oak, their bows sheathed with iron plates designed to cut through ice. These were not elegant ships, but brutal instruments, built to smash their way through obstacles. The technological modifications made to these ships represented the cutting edge of 1840s innovation. Steam engines, taken from railway locomotives and modified for marine use, were installed in both vessels. These engines could produce 25 horsepower, not much by modern standards, but revolutionary for Arctic exploration. They meant the ships could make progress even when wind failed, could maneuver in tight spaces between ice floes, could fight against currents that would trap a sailing vessel. The engines consumed enormous quantities of coal, but the ship's holds were modified to carry enough for 12 days of continuous steaming. Perhaps even more innovative was the heating system installed in both ships. A network of pipes would carry hot water from the galley stoves throughout the vessels, keeping living quarters at a temperature that, while not warm, would at least prevent the crews from freezing to death in their bunks. Previous Arctic expeditions had suffered terribly from cold, with men losing fingers and toes to frostbite while sleeping. This heating system promised to make Arctic wintering not comfortable, but at least survivable. The provisions loaded onto the ships represented another supposed triumph of modern technology. The expedition carried 32,289 pounds of preserved meat in tins, 33,289 pounds of biscuit, 7,088 pounds of tobacco, 4,980 pounds of chocolate, 7,637 pounds of butter, 1,225 gallons of concentrated spirits, 200 gallons of wine for the sick, and thousands of pounds of other supplies including sugar, tea, coffee, and pickled vegetables. The tinned food was the key innovation. Previous expeditions had relied on salted meat that spoiled, but these sealed tins would theoretically keep food fresh for years. The tins came from Stephen Goldner, a London provisioner who had won the contract by significantly underbidding his competitors. Goldner promised to deliver 29,500 pounds of preserved meat, 11,814 pounds of preserved vegetables, and 11,262 pounds of soup in sealed tins. To meet this enormous order on schedule and within budget, Goldner cut corners. He used cheap lead solder and applied it hastily and excessively. Many tins had thick beads of solder on the interior, where they would come into direct contact with food. Some tins were poorly sealed, allowing bacteria to enter. Others were filled with substandard meat, already partially spoiled before canning. The officers selected for the expedition represented a cross-section of naval society, from aristocratic younger sons seeking glory to middle-class professionals hoping for advancement. Commander James Fitzjames, appointed as Franklin's second-in-command on Erebus, was perhaps the most interesting. At 32, Fitzjames was everything Franklin wasn't: young, handsome, witty, and charismatic. He was also almost certainly illegitimate, his parentage carefully obscured in official records, raised by relatives who never quite explained his origins. This shadow over his birth drove him to excel, to prove himself worthy through achievement rather than breeding. Fitzjames wrote constantly and brilliantly. His letters and journals from before the expedition reveal a man of sharp intelligence and humor. About Franklin, he wrote with affectionate condescension, "I never felt that the captain was so much my companion as my messmate. He is a dry, cold man, one who I think would not intentionally do wrong, but he appears to me to think nothing of carrying out an unpleasant order." He added more generously, "But I have seen him minutely, attentive to the comfort of every person on board, and he is universally liked by the men." Captain Francis Crozier, commanding Terror, was Franklin's opposite in almost every way. Irish, working class, and thoroughly experienced in polar navigation, Crozier had spent more time in the Arctic and Antarctic than Franklin and Fitzjames combined. He had served with William Edward Parry on 3 Arctic expeditions and with James Clark Ross in the Antarctic. He knew ice, understood its moods and dangers in ways Franklin never would. But Crozier was also depressive, alcoholic, and had just been rejected in marriage by Franklin's niece, Sophia Craycroft, a humiliation that gnawed at him. Crozier's letters before departure pulse with dread. To his friend James Clark Ross, he wrote, "I am not at all comfortable about this expedition. Franklin is very decided in his own views, but has not the energy to make them of use." To another friend, he was even more direct. "Would that I were not going, but I am committed and must make the best of it." He sensed disaster coming but felt powerless to prevent it. Among the junior officers were men whose names would become footnotes to tragedy. Lieutenant Graham Gore of Erebus was considered one of the finest young officers in the Navy. Handsome, accomplished, from a good family, he wrote poetry and painted watercolors, planning to document the Arctic's terrible beauty. Lieutenant James Walter Fairholme, also of Erebus, was deeply religious, organizing Bible study groups and prayer meetings. He wrote to his father about bringing God's word to the Arctic wilderness. The ice masters, James Reed on Erebus and Thomas Blanky on Terror, were civilian specialists hired for their expertise in navigating frozen seas. Reed was a Scot from Aberdeen who had spent decades in Arctic whaling. Blanky was from Hull, equally experienced, but with a reputation for dark humor and pessimism that would prove justified. These men knew ice in ways the naval officers never could, understood its subtle signals and warnings, but their advice would too often be ignored in favor of naval protocol and Franklin's stubborn determination. The surgeons and assistant surgeons represented the medical establishment's best attempt to maintain health in the Arctic. Stephen Stanley, surgeon on Erebus, was competent but unimaginative, a man who followed medical orthodoxy even when it clearly wasn't working. Harry Goodser, assistant surgeon on Erebus, was different. A brilliant naturalist, more interested in Arctic fauna than medicine. He brought microscopes, specimen jars, and endless enthusiasm for scientific discovery. His letters homebubble with excitement about the specimens he would collect, the scientific papers he would write, the reputation he would make. Among the regular sailors and marines were men from every corner of Britain and its empire. John Torrington, the 20-year-old stoker from Manchester who would be the first to die, was already showing signs of tuberculosis but desperate for work. The Industrial Revolution had destroyed traditional employment, and the Navy offered steady pay and food. Arctic service meant double wages, enough to support his widowed mother for years if he survived. William Brain, a 32-year-old Royal Marine, had a wife and 2 children in Chatham. He had joined the expedition for the bonus pay and the possibility of promotion. His wife was pregnant with their 3rd child when he left. She would give birth to a son who would never know his father, who would grow up knowing only that his father had sailed north and never returned. The expedition also included 4 cabin boys, teenagers who served the officers and were supposed to learn seamanship. These boys, George Chambers, David Young, Robert Golding, and Thomas Evans, were between 14 and 18 years old. They had joined for adventure, for the chance to see the world beyond Britain's sooty industrial cities. They would have been better off staying in those cities, however grim. As departure approached in May 1845, London was gripped by Franklin fever. Newspapers competed for the most patriotic coverage. The Illustrated London News published detailed drawings of the ships and their equipment. The Times proclaimed, "The name of Franklin alone is a national guarantee. Never was an expedition dispatched with more favourable prospects of success." Even Punch, the satirical magazine, got involved, publishing cartoons of Franklin planting the British flag at the North Pole while polar bears saluted. The final preparations were meticulous. Every item was catalogued, every procedure documented. The ships carried an astonishing variety of items beyond basic supplies. 2,700 pounds of candles, 1,225 pounds of soap, 2,900 pounds of tobacco, a hand organ for entertainment, mahogany writing desks, cut-glass wine decanters, silver cutlery engraved with the officers' initials, fine china, dress uniforms for formal dinners, and a library of 1,200 volumes, including novels, technical manuals, and religious texts. They also carried scientific instruments of every description, chronometers for navigation, magnetic instruments for studying the Earth's magnetic field, barometers, thermometers, telescopes, and even a daguerreotype camera to document their triumph. Franklin was determined that this would be not just a successful navigation of the Northwest Passage, but a scientific expedition that would advance human knowledge in multiple fields. On May 19, 1845, the expedition departed from Greenhithe on the Thames. The scene was extraordinary. Thousands of spectators lined both banks of the river. Ships in port flew flags and fired salutes. The marine band played patriotic songs. Ladies waved handkerchiefs while gentlemen raised their hats. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see history being made. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with just enough breeze to flutter the flags photogenically. Franklin's last public words were recorded by multiple newspapers. "With God's blessing and British courage, we shall succeed where others have failed. We shall bring honour to our Queen and glory to our nation. We sail not into the unknown, but into history." The crowd erupted in cheers so loud they could be heard miles away. The ship's cannons fired a 21-gun salute that rattled windows throughout Greenheath. Lady Franklin maintained perfect composure throughout the departure ceremony. She stood on the dock in a new blue silk dress, waving a handkerchief, smiling for the crowd. Only those standing very close could see that her hands were trembling. As the ships rounded the bend in the Thames and disappeared from view, she suddenly swayed and had to be supported by her companions. "I have done my duty," she reportedly said, though what duty she meant, as a wife sending her husband off with good cheer, or as the orchestrator of his appointment to this command, remains unclear. The expedition's first stop was Stromness in the Orkney Islands, where they took on fresh water and additional supplies, including live cattle to be slaughtered during the voyage. Here, they also picked up the last mail from home. Franklin wrote to his wife, "We are all in excellent spirits. The officers and men work together harmoniously. I have never felt more confident of success. The ships perform admirably under steam and sail." From Orkney, they crossed the North Atlantic to Greenland, encountering their first ice. It was loose pack ice, easily pushed aside by the reinforced bows. The steam engines proved their worth, allowing steady progress when the wind died. The crews were still learning to work as teams, with the inevitable personality clashes and adjustments, but morale remained high. They were, after all, on a great adventure, part of history in the making. On July 4, 1845, they anchored at the Whalefish Islands off Greenland's west coast. This would be their last contact with European civilization. Here, 5 men were discharged and sent home aboard the supply ship Barretto Jr. The official reason was illness, but the specific nature of their ailments was never recorded. Were they showing early symptoms of tuberculosis? Had they suffered accidents? Or had they simply lost their nerve when faced with the reality of Arctic exploration? Their discharge would prove to be their salvation. The letters home from Greenland are heartbreaking to read now. James Fitzjames wrote to his brother, "We are very happy and very comfortable. The ships are magnificent. Everything is in perfect order, and we have stores for 3 years, but I think we shall be home in 2. Harry Goodser wrote excitedly to his father about the specimens he had already collected. "I have 40 species of birds, numerous insects, and several plants unknown to science. The real treasures await us in the unexplored regions ahead." Lieutenant Fairholme wrote to his father about the religious life of the expedition. "Divine service is well attended. Even the rough sailors seem touched by the magnificence of God's creation in these latitudes. I feel we are doing his work in extending the bounds of human knowledge." These last letters show no hint of concern, no premonition of disaster. Everyone seemed confident that they would be home within 2 years, covered in glory. On July 12, 1845, the expedition left Greenland, crossing Baffin Bay toward Lancaster Sound, the eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage. This crossing could be treacherous. Baffin Bay was often choked with icebergs, carved from Greenland's glaciers and pack ice driven by unpredictable currents. But 1845 was a good ice year. The bay was relatively clear, with only scattered bergs that the ships easily avoided. Life aboard ship settled into routine. The Navy ran on routine. It was what held men together in the isolation and monotony of long voyages. The day began at 5:30 a.m. with the bosun's whistle. Hammocks were stowed, decks scrubbed, brass polished. Breakfast at 8 o'clock was bagu, a porridge made from crushed ship's biscuit, served with preserved meat and weak tea. The men ate in messes of 8, huddled around tables that swung with the ship's motion. Work continued through the morning. Sail handling, maintenance, watchkeeping. Officers took observations, recording position, weather, ice conditions. The ice masters watched for leads, channels of open water through the pack. The engine room crew maintained the steam engines, complex machines that required constant attention. Coal had to be moved from storage to bunkers, ash removed and dumped overboard, bearings greased, pipes checked for leaks. Lunch at noon was the main meal. Preserved meat, preserved vegetables, ship's biscuit, and lime juice to prevent scurvy. The lime juice was often frozen solid and had to be thawed before serving. Many men complained about its bitter taste and tried to avoid drinking it, not understanding that their lives might depend on this daily dose of vitamin C, though in fact, the lime juice had been boiled during preparation, destroying much of its vitamin content, another technological innovation that would prove fatally flawed. Afternoons brought more work, but also education for those who wanted it. Officers gave lectures on navigation, mathematics, and natural history. Reading and writing classes were held for illiterate sailors. The ship's libraries were available, though only officers could borrow books freely. Common sailors had to request specific titles through their division officers. a system that discouraged many from reading at all. Dinner at 4 p.m. was a smaller meal, usually leftovers from lunch, perhaps with the addition of pickled vegetables or preserved fruit. On Sundays there was plum duff, a boiled pudding that was the highlight of the week's menu. The officers dined separately in the gunroom, using the expedition's fine china and silver, maintaining the social distinctions that define Victorian society even in the Arctic. Evenings brought what entertainment the men could create. Someone would play a fiddle or accordion. Sea shanties would be sung, growing increasingly bawdy as the night wore on. Card games and dice were technically forbidden but widely tolerated. Officers might stage readings from Shakespeare or other classics. On special occasions, there would be theatrical performances with men dressed in drag-playing female roles, a Navy tradition that provided both entertainment and an outlet for tensions. The biggest challenge was not the work, but the monotony. Day after day of the same faces, the same routines, the same grey sea and white ice. Men who had been friends became irritants. Small habits, the way someone chewed, breathed or hummed, became intolerable. Fights broke out over trivial matters. The officers had to maintain strict discipline to prevent minor conflicts from escalating into serious violence. On July 26, 1845, the expedition encountered Captain Dannet of the whaling ship Prince of Wales in northern Baffin Bay. This would be the last time European eyes would see Franklin's men alive. The two naval ships were moored to an iceberg, waiting for conditions to improve before entering Lancaster Sound. Dannet reported that the expedition appeared to be in excellent condition. The crews lined the rails, waving and cheering. Franklin invited Dannet aboard for dinner, and they discussed ice conditions and navigation strategies. Dannet offered to carry mail back to England, triggering a final flurry of letter writing. These last messages are mundane, giving no hint of concern. Men wrote about the weather, the wildlife they had seen, their daily routines. They sent love to families, asked about local news, promised to bring back Arctic souvenirs. One sailor wrote to his sweetheart, "The ice is beautiful beyond description, like God's own cathedral. I shall bring you a piece to keep in our home when we are married." After leaving Dannet, the expedition entered Lancaster Sound and vanished from recorded history. What happened next must be pieced together from physical evidence found years or decades later, from Inuit oral histories, long dismissed by British authorities, and from modern scientific analysis. The story that emerges is one of gradually escalating catastrophe, each decision seeming reasonable at the time, but contributing to ultimate disaster. Lancaster Sound in late July 1845 offered excellent conditions. The sound was largely ice-free, with only scattered floes that posed no serious obstacle. The ships made good progress westward, following their orders to push through Lancaster Sound until they found a passage south toward the mainland of North America. Officers would have been busy charting their course, taking magnetic readings, recording weather and ice conditions. This was exploration at its most exciting. Sailing through waters that appeared on no detailed charts, every headland a new discovery. At some point in early August, Franklin made a fateful decision. Instead of continuing west through Lancaster Sound toward Viscount Melville Sound, or turning south through Peel Sound as his orders suggested, he directed the ships north up Wellington Channel. This decision has puzzled historians for over a century. Why abandon the relatively known route for completely uncharted waters? Several theories exist. The ice conditions in Peel Sound might have been unfavorable, blocked by pack ice, driven by wind and current. Franklin might have received intelligence from whalers about open water to the north. He might have been following secret Admiralty orders to explore Wellington Channel for strategic reasons. Or he might have simply believed that Wellington Channel would curve west and provide a better route to the Pacific. We know the ships sailed far up Wellington Channel because of debris found by later search expeditions. They may have reached 77 degrees north latitude, further north than any ships had penetrated in this region. For a few weeks, it must have been exhilarating. They were true explorers, sailing into the absolute unknown, claiming new territory for Britain with every mile. The officers would have been naming newly discovered islands, capes, and bays, immortalizing themselves and their patrons in Arctic geography. But Wellington Channel proved to be a dead end. blocked by permanent polar ice that no amount of steam power could penetrate. By late August or early September, Franklin must have realized his mistake. The brief Arctic summer was ending. New ice was already forming in the channels behind them. They needed to find winter quarters immediately, or risk being frozen in an exposed position where wind and ice pressure could destroy the ships. The retreat from Wellington Channel must have been desperate, racing against time, fighting through ice that grew thicker each day, knowing that every hour of delay increased their danger. They made it back to the relative safety of Lancaster Sound, then sailed around Cornwallis Island to its western side. Here they found a small island, Beechey Island, with a protected bay that seemed perfect for winter quarters. The establishment of winter quarters at Beechey Island followed standard Arctic expedition procedures. The ships were anchored securely in the bay, positioned to minimize exposure to wind and ice pressure. Supplies were unloaded and cached on shore in case the ships were damaged. Work parties were organized to collect fresh water from snow and ice. A magnetic observatory was established for scientific observations. Workshops were set up on shore for carpentry and metalwork. Preparing for the polar winter required enormous effort. The ship's rigging was reduced to minimize snow accumulation and wind resistance. Canvas covers were stretched over the decks to create additional insulation. The heating systems were tested and adjusted. Coal supplies were inventoried and rationed. Every preparation that experience and forethought could suggest was implemented. As the sun disappeared below the horizon in early November, not to return for 4 months, the real test began. The polar night at 74 degrees north latitude is absolute. Not just darkness, but a pressing, tangible absence of light that seems to have weight and substance. The only illumination came from candles and oil lamps, creating small pools of yellow light in the vast darkness. Outside, the aurora borealis would sometimes dance across the sky in sheets of green and blue. Beautiful, but somehow menacing, emphasizing how far they were from anything familiar. The cold was beyond anything most of the men had experienced. Temperatures dropped to -40, -50, even -60 Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, strange things happen. Breath freezes instantly into ice crystals that fall like snow. Metal burns exposed skin. Sound travels differently, with conversations audible at impossible distances, while footsteps nearby seem muffled. The ice constantly groans and cracks with sounds like artillery fire, keeping men awake with fear that the ice is breaking up around them. To combat the psychological effects of the polar night, Franklin imposed a strict routine. Morning prayers were mandatory, with Franklin himself often leading the service. Educational classes continued: navigation, mathematics, reading and writing. Scientific observations were maintained religiously, with officers taking turns to record magnetic variations, weather conditions, and astronomical phenomena. Entertainment became crucial for morale. The expedition had brought a hand organ, and someone had to play it for an hour each evening, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. Theatrical performances were staged every 2 weeks. These productions grew increasingly elaborate, with costumes made from spare materials, sets painted on sail canvas, and scripts adapted from the ship's libraries or written by the men themselves. The tradition of men playing female roles led to sometimes hilarious, sometimes disturbing performances that revealed the psychological strain of isolation. But something was already going wrong. Men were falling ill in unusual numbers with symptoms that baffled the surgeons. Severe headaches, abdominal pain, weakness, irritability, and confusion affected dozens of men. The surgeons attributed it to the cold and darkness, prescribing the standard remedies: lime juice for scurvy, though no one showed scurvy symptoms yet, rum for morale, and exercise for general fitness. Nothing helped. If anything, the symptoms grew worse. The food was part of the problem, though no one understood it yet. When tins were opened, many contained meat that was obviously spoiled, green, putrid, and crawling with bacteria, despite being preserved. These were discarded, but this meant the expedition was consuming its food supplies faster than planned. Other tins seemed fine, but had a peculiar metallic taste that some men complained about. The complaints were dismissed as typical sailor grumbling about food. Unknown to anyone, the lead soldier used to seal the tins was leaching into the food, especially acidic foods like tomatoes and vegetables. Every meal delivered a dose of lead into the men's bodies. Lead is a cumulative poison. It builds up in bones and soft tissues, causing increasingly severe symptoms. At low levels, it causes fatigue, irritability, and mild confusion. At higher levels, it causes severe abdominal pain, paralysis, seizures, and death. The expedition was slowly poisoning itself with every meal. On January 1st, 1846, John Torrington died. He was only 20, a stoker on Terror who had been showing signs of tuberculosis even before the expedition departed. But the speed of his decline had shocked everyone. In his final days, he was delirious, calling for his mother, talking to people who weren't there. His body was wasted to nothing, skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken in his skull. Death, when it came, seemed almost merciful. 3 days later, John Hartnell died. He was 25, an able seaman on Erebus who had seemed healthy until a few weeks before his death. He complained of weakness and confusion, but nothing that seemed immediately life-threatening. He died in his sleep, found frozen in his hammock during the morning watch change. His messmates reported that he had been acting strangely in his final days, forgetting where he was, unable to remember simple tasks he had performed hundreds of times. The deaths cast a shadow over the expedition that no amount of forced cheer could dispel. Death was always a possibility in Arctic exploration, but these deaths seemed wrong somehow. Too early, too mysterious. The men whispered that the expedition was cursed. Some recalled old sailors' superstitions about ships with ominous names. Erebus meant place of darkness in Greek mythology. Terror spoke for itself. Franklin tried to maintain morale through the remainder of the polar night. He increased the rum ration, organized extra theatrical performances, and gave inspiring speeches about duty and glory. But privately, he was worried. His journal from this period, never found but referenced in other documents, apparently expressed concern about the mysterious illness affecting his men and the faster-than-expected consumption of supplies. The return of the sun in late February 1846 brought relief and renewed energy. The temperature rose to a relatively balmy -20. The ice in the bay began to crack and shift, suggesting it might break up earlier than expected. Work parties were organized to prepare the ships for navigation. The rigging was restored, engines tested, supplies reorganized. But first, there were the dead to bury. The ground was still frozen solid, requiring enormous effort to dig graves. The burials were conducted with full naval honors, despite the difficulty of assembling in the extreme cold. Franklin read from the Book of Common Prayer while the men stood at attention, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The graves were carefully constructed with stone borders and wooden headboards carved with names, dates, and biblical verses. A third death occurred on April 3rd. William Brain, 32, a Royal Marine private on Erebus. Like Hartnell, his death was mysterious. No obvious illness, just gradual weakness and mental confusion. The pattern was becoming clear to the surgeons even if they didn't understand the cause. Men were dying of some wasting disease that affected both body and mind. The 3 graves on Beechey Island would become one of the most famous sites in Arctic exploration. When they were discovered in 1850, they seemed to tell a story of a well-organized expedition dealing with expected casualties. The careful construction of the graves, the detailed headboards, the biblical inscriptions all suggested that things were still under control. It wouldn't be until the 1980s, when the bodies were exhumed and analyzed, that the true horror would be revealed. Lead levels in the corpses that were 10 to 20 times higher than normal. Clear evidence of severe lead poisoning. Spring and early summer 1846 was spent preparing to resume navigation. The mysterious illness continued to affect many men, but not fatally. The surgeons experimented with different treatments, varying the diet, increasing exercise, changing the ventilation in the ships. Nothing seemed to make much difference. Some men improved temporarily only to relapse. Others showed a steady decline that no treatment could arrest. The ice in the bay finally broke up in July 1846, later than hoped, but not unusually so. The expedition departed Beechey Island, leaving behind a cairn with records of their stay as per Admiralty regulations. Strangely, these records, found by searchers in 1850, contained only basic information: dates, positions, names of the dead. There was no mention of the mysterious illness, no indication of problems. Perhaps Franklin didn't want to record anything that might be seen as criticism of the expedition's preparation, or perhaps he genuinely believed the worst was over. The summer of 1846 proved exceptional for ice conditions. The channels were remarkably clear of pack ice. The expedition made excellent progress south through Peel Sound and along the western shore of Somerset Island. For the first time since leaving Beechey Island, they were in completely uncharted waters. Every cape, every bay, every island was a new discovery. The officers broke out the champagne they had saved for special occasions, toasting their progress and their anticipated success. By early September 1846, they had reached the northern tip of King William Island. Here, Franklin faced a crucial decision. The charts showed King William Land as a peninsula connected to the mainland, but Franklin suspected, correctly, that it might be an island. If it was a peninsula, they had to sail around its western shore. If it was an island, the eastern route might be better. Franklin chose west. This decision sealed their fate. Unknown to Franklin, the western shore of King William Island is where a massive ice stream flows down from the polar ice cap. This river of ice, miles wide and hundreds of feet thick, moves constantly southward, carrying everything in its path. It's some of the thickest, most dangerous ice in the entire Arctic. Ships caught in this stream aren't just frozen in place. They're carried along like leaves in a river, slowly being crushed by pressure that can exceed 100,000 pounds per square inch. On September 12, 1846, disaster struck. Both ships became beset, trapped in ice that formed around them with shocking speed. Within hours, they were locked solid, unable to move in any direction. The ice was different from what they had experienced at Beechey Island. This wasn't stable coastal ice, but dynamic pack ice, constantly moving, grinding, building pressure. The ships creaked and groaned under the strain. Ice piled up against their hulls, sometimes rising higher than the deck rails. At first, the situation didn't seem catastrophic. Many Arctic expeditions had been frozen in for a winter. They would simply wait for the next summer's thaw. They were well supplied, experienced in Arctic wintering, and in a relatively protected position. What they didn't know was that this particular ice rarely melted completely. Ships caught in it could remain trapped for years, slowly being crushed as the ice moved and compressed. The second winter, 1846 to 47, was when the true horror began. The ships weren't stationary but were being carried slowly south by the ice stream. They were also being gradually crushed. The pressure was relentless but irregular, sometimes building for days until something gave way with a crack like thunder, sometimes releasing suddenly, causing the ships to lurch violently. Water seeped through opening seams and immediately froze, adding weight and stress to the already strained hulls. The lead poisoning was now affecting everyone to some degree. Men suffered from severe abdominal pain that the surgeons couldn't explain or treat. Confusion and memory loss became common. Some men forgot their own names, couldn't remember what year it was, or became convinced they were somewhere else entirely. The surgeons, themselves affected by lead poisoning, struggled to maintain any kind of medical treatment. The food situation was deteriorating rapidly. More and more tins proved to be spoiled when opened. The preserved meat was green and putrid, the vegetables brown mush, the soup a bacterial stew that caused violent illness in anyone who ate it. They were forced to reduce rations, then reduce them again. Men began to lose weight rapidly, their bodies consuming themselves to stay warm in the brutal cold. The heating systems that had seemed so innovative were failing. The pipes froze and burst. Coal supplies dwindled faster than expected. Ice formed inside the ships, coating everything with a thick layer of frost. Men woke to find their blankets frozen to the deck above them. Breath condensed and froze on beards and mustaches, forming ice masks that had to be painfully chipped away. The temperature inside the ships dropped to -20, -30, not much warmer than outside. Scurvy began to appear, despite the daily lime juice ration. Men's gums bled and swelled. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Old scars reopened as collagen broke down. Some men's legs swelled grotesquely, turning purple and black. The smell of rotting flesh permeated the ships as men literally began to decompose while still alive. The lime juice that was supposed to prevent scurvy had lost most of its vitamin C during the boiling process used to preserve it. Another technological innovation that had failed catastrophically. Discipline began to break down. Men refused orders, knowing that naval punishment meant nothing when everyone was dying. Some deserted their posts, hiding in remote corners of the ships. Others lay in their hammocks, no longer even pretending to work, waiting for death. Fights broke out over food, over blankets, over perceived insults. The officers struggled to maintain order, but they were dying too, their authority evaporating as their bodies failed. The polar night of 1846 to 47 was a season in hell. In the absolute darkness, with the temperature at -50 and the ice constantly groaning and cracking around them, men's minds began to break. Some claimed to see dead shipmates walking the decks. Others heard voices calling from the ice. One man became convinced that the ship was actually in Portsmouth Harbour and tried to go ashore, freezing to death on the ice before he could be rescued. Christmas 1846 passed with only token celebration. There was an attempt at a special meal, but it was the same half-rotten preserved meat they had been eating for months. Franklin tried to give a speech, but lost his train of thought halfway through and had to be helped back to his cabin. The traditional toasts were made, but many men were too sick to participate. The hand organ was played, but its cheerful tunes seemed to mock their suffering. By January 1847, men were dying regularly. Not dramatic deaths, but slow fading away. They stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped moving, and eventually stopped breathing. The bodies couldn't be buried in the frozen ground, so they were stacked in the holds like cordwood, frozen solid, waiting for spring. But spring seemed impossibly far away, and many wondered if they would live to see it. Franklin himself was failing. At 61, the cold affected him more severely than younger men. He had lost significant weight, his formerly round face now gaunt and hollow. He spent most of his time in his cabin, emerging only for essential duties. When he did appear, he tried to project confidence and authority, but everyone could see he was dying. His speeches became rambling and confused, mixing biblical quotations with naval regulations, sometimes forgetting where he was or what he was saying. The officers tried to maintain some semblance of normal routine, but it was increasingly difficult. The daily observations were still recorded, but the entries became shorter, more confused. Dates were wrong, positions miscalculated, entire weeks missing. The neat copperplate handwriting of the early voyage degenerated into barely legible scrawls. Between the lines, you can feel the desperation, the gradual collapse of everything they had believed in. In February 1847, there was nearly a mutiny on Terror. Several men, driven mad by lead poisoning and starvation, became convinced that Captain Crozier was hoarding food, that the officers were eating while the men starved. They attempted to break into the officers' stores, but were stopped by Marines who remained loyal. The ringleaders were flogged, but everyone knew the punishment was meaningless. Naval discipline, the foundation of their entire world, was crumbling. Spring 1847 brought no relief. The ice showed no signs of breaking up. If anything, it was thicker and more compressed than the previous year. The ships had been carried miles south from where they were first trapped, but they were still locked solid. Pressure ridges rose 40 feet high around them, mountains of ice that would take weeks to cut through, even if they had the strength to try. In April 1847, Franklin convened a meeting of senior officers in his cabin on Erebus. The scene must have been surreal. Skeletal men in ragged uniforms, huddled in a frozen cabin, trying to maintain military protocol while discussing their increasingly hopeless situation. They reviewed their supplies, food running dangerously low, fuel almost exhausted, medicine depleted, men dying daily. Crozier argued for abandoning the ships immediately and attempting to walk to safety. Franklin refused. He would not abandon his command while there was any hope of the ships being freed. They compromised by sending out a sledge party to leave a record of their position and situation. On May 24, 1847, Lieutenant Graham Gore led 6 men to King William Island. They built a cairn at Victory Point and deposited a standard Admiralty form. The message, written in Gore's neat hand, was surprisingly routine. It gave their position, mentioned wintering at Beechey Island, noted that they had sailed up Wellington Channel, and ended with, "All well." This phrase, "all well," written when men were dying daily, when the ships were being crushed, when starvation and lead poisoning were destroying the expedition, seems either desperately optimistic or bitterly ironic. 2 weeks later, on June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. The exact cause of Franklin's death remains unknown. It might have been a stroke or heart attack, his elderly body finally giving out under the strain. It might have been pneumonia or another infection that his weakened immune system couldn't fight. Or he might have simply given up, unable to face the failure of everything he had worked for. He died in his cabin, probably attended by Fitzjames and the ship's surgeons, though there was little they could do except ease his passing with laudanum or morphine. Franklin's death shattered what remained of expedition morale. Whatever his failings as a leader, his inflexibility, his poor judgment, his refusal to adapt, he had been the center around which everything revolved. His social position, his naval rank, his persona as a father figure had held the expedition together through 2 terrible winters. Without him, the fragile structure of command began to collapse entirely. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, who had never wanted to be there and now found himself presiding over a catastrophe. Crozier was competent and experienced, probably the best Arctic sailor on either ship. But he was also Irish and working class, facts that mattered even when everyone was dying. Some officers, particularly on Erebus, resented taking orders from someone they considered their social inferior. The careful hierarchy that had defined naval life for centuries was breaking down along with everything else. James Fitzjames, as the senior officer on Erebus, could have challenged Crozier's authority, but didn't. By now, Fitzjames had lost all his cheerful optimism. He was suffering from advanced scurvy, his gums bleeding, his teeth loose, old scars reopening. His journal entries from this period, if they still exist somewhere in the Arctic ice, probably document the complete collapse of the expedition. But we have only fragments, hints, references in other documents to his growing despair. Summer 1847 passed without the ice releasing its grip on the ships. If anything, the pressure increased. Terror's hull was visibly deformed, plates buckling inward, seams opening. During high-pressure events, water poured in through gaps, freezing instantly into ice that added more weight to the dying ship. Erebus fared slightly better, but was also showing signs of imminent structural failure. The constant groaning and cracking of the hulls kept everyone on edge, wondering if this would be the moment when the ships finally collapsed. The food situation was now beyond critical. They had eaten everything remotely edible: leather boots, canvas, candles made from tallow. Some men tried to eat soap, others gnawed on leather belts and straps. The last of the preserved meat was gone, or so spoiled that eating it meant certain death from food poisoning. They were starving in one of the most barren regions on Earth, where even in summer there was almost no wildlife to hunt. The few hunting parties that ventured out found King William Island almost devoid of life. This island is one of the most desolate places in the Arctic, supporting virtually no land animals and few seals. Occasionally, they might spot an Arctic fox or a few ptarmigan, but nowhere near enough to feed over 100 starving men. The Inuit avoided this region for good reason. There was nothing here to sustain human life. By autumn 1847, the lead poisoning had reached catastrophic levels in many men. They suffered from severe neurological symptoms, paralysis, seizures, hallucinations. Some men believed they were back in England, carrying on conversations with family members long dead. Others became violent, attacking shipmates over imagined offences, requiring restraint that the weakened crew could barely manage. The surgeons, themselves suffering from lead poisoning, could only watch helplessly as men's minds disintegrated. The third winter, 1847 to 48, defies description. The ships were failing structurally, with ice forming inside as water leaked through broken seams. The temperature inside dropped so low that men froze to death in their sleep. There was virtually no food, except for leather and rope boiled into a bitter soup. Men were dying daily, their bodies stacked like frozen logs because no one had the strength to move them. Discipline completely collapsed. Officers' orders were ignored. Men fought over scraps of leather, over positions near the few remaining heat sources, over blankets stolen from the dead. Some men simply lay down and refused to move, waiting for death. Others wandered the ships in delirium, talking to people who weren't there, acting out scenes from their past lives, their minds completely gone. There were persistent rumors, never confirmed, that cannibalism began during this winter. Not organized cannibalism, but desperate individuals secretly feeding on the dead. Bodies disappeared from the makeshift morgues. Men were found with suspicious wounds that might have been knife marks. The officers, if they knew, said nothing. What was the point of maintaining civilized values when civilization had abandoned them? Christmas 1847 passed without acknowledgement. There was no attempt at celebration, no special meal, no religious service. Most men didn't even know it was Christmas. Time had lost all meaning in the perpetual darkness and suffering. Days blurred together in an endless nightmare of cold, hunger, and death. The only calendar that mattered was the count of who was still alive. By March 1848, Crozier made the inevitable decision. They must abandon the ships and attempt to walk to safety. It was a desperate gamble. The nearest outpost was over 1,000 miles away at the mouth of the Back River. They would have to drag boats and supplies across the ice, then navigate the river to reach help. For healthy, well-fed men with proper equipment, it would be a difficult journey. For starving, scurvy-ridden, lead-poisoned men, it was virtually impossible. But staying meant certain death. The preparations took weeks. They had to decide what to take. Every item meant more weight to drag, but might mean the difference between life and death. The ship's boats had to be mounted on sledges, constructed from whatever materials they could salvage. Food, such as it was, had to be distributed. Weapons for hunting, navigation equipment, medical supplies, clothing. Every decision was agonizing because they knew they couldn't take everything, and choosing wrong meant death. Here, the lead poisoning showed its full effect on judgment. When bodies were found years later, they carried bizarre items: silver place settings, brass curtain rods, books, a mahogany writing desk. Why burden themselves with such useless weight? The answer probably lies in the neurological effects of severe lead poisoning, which impairs judgment and decision-making. Or perhaps these items had taken on talismanic significance, representing the civilization they were losing, the world that had made sense before the Arctic destroyed everything they knew. On April 22nd, 1848, they abandoned the ships. 105 souls prepared to leave. 24 had already died. The scene must have been apocalyptic. A ragged line of skeletal figures in tattered uniforms assembling on the ice in the dim Arctic spring light. Many could barely walk, leaning on improvised crutches or supported by stronger comrades. Some had to be loaded onto sledges like cargo, too weak to stand. Before leaving, Crozier and Fitzjames returned to the cairn at Victory Point to update the record Gore had left the previous year. The addendum, squeezed into the margins of the paper in handwriting that showed the strain, provided the crucial facts. Franklin was dead. 24 men were dead in total. they were abandoning the ships and heading for Back River. The date was given as April the 25th, 1848. This would be the last written communication from the expedition ever found. The march south began in conditions that would challenge healthy men. The ice was never smooth, but rather a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, some rising 30 or 40 feet high. The surface varied from ice polished smooth as glass to deep snow that swallowed men to their waists. Leads of open water appeared suddenly, forcing long detours. The boats, mounted on sledges, caught the wind like sails, adding massive resistance. Each sledge weighed over a ton and required 7 healthy men to pull efficiently, but they had perhaps 3 or 4 skeletal figures in harness. The cold was still brutal despite it being spring. Temperatures of -20 to -30 were common, with winds that cut through their ragged clothing like knives. Many men had no proper boots, their feet wrapped in canvas and rope that provided little protection. Frostbite was universal. Fingers, toes, noses, ears turning black and dying. The smell of gangrenous flesh added to the general misery. Men began dropping almost immediately. Some sat down to rest and never got up, freezing solid within hours. Others wandered off in confusion and were found days later, if at all. Some collapsed in harness and were cut free and abandoned where they fell. There was no strength for burial, no time for ceremony. The dead were simply left behind, markers of the expedition's route for future searchers to find. Within days, the column began to fragment. The stronger men moved ahead, the weaker fell behind. Small groups broke off, each convinced they knew a better route, or simply unable to continue with the main party. Some turned back toward the ships, perhaps hoping the ice had freed them, perhaps simply wanting to die in familiar surroundings. Discipline, already fragile, disappeared entirely. It was every man for himself, or small groups bound together by friendship or desperation. Years later, Inuit hunters would report encountering groups of white men during this period. The strangers were described as thin as skeletons, dragging sledges, clearly starving. Some walked strangely, stumbling and weaving, symptoms of severe lead poisoning. Their mouths were black and bleeding, scurvy, and they made desperate gestures indicating hunger. The Inuit, living on the edge of survival themselves, could offer little help. They gave what food they could spare, some seal meat, perhaps, but the strangers' mouths were too damaged to chew properly. The Inuit left them to their fate, knowing there was nothing more they could do. Other Inuit stories passed down through generations tell of finding camps filled with dead white men. Some of these camps showed clear evidence of cannibalism. Bodies that had been butchered, bones cracked for marrow, skulls opened to access the brains. These stories, when first reported to British authorities in the 1850s, were dismissed as savage fantasies. The idea that Royal Navy officers and men would resort to cannibalism was considered not just unlikely, but blasphemous, an insult to British civilization. But the Inuit were telling the truth. Modern forensic analysis of bones found at various sites confirms clear evidence of cannibalism. The cut marks on bones are consistent with butchering. The pattern of which bones were broken and which were left intact matches what would be expected if bodies were processed for maximum caloric extraction. The skulls show evidence of being open to access the brain, one of the most calorie-rich organs. The main group, probably led by Crozier, continued south along the western coast of King William Island. Progress was agonizingly slow, perhaps a mile a day when conditions were good, nothing when blizzards struck or when they encountered impassable pressure ridges. At night, they huddled in canvas tents that provided little protection from the cold. There was no fuel for fires, no way to warm food even if they had any. They gnawed on leather and rope. Their last, food, long exhausted. At some point, probably in May 1848, the main group split. One faction continued toward the Back River. Another group, possibly led by Fitzjames, attempted to return to the ships. A third group simply stopped, too exhausted to continue, setting up a final camp on the southern shore of King William Island at what is now called Starvation Cove. The Starvation Cove site tells its own horrible story. Here, searchers found the remains of at least 4 men, some showing signs of cannibalism. Personal effects suggested these were officers or senior petty officers, men who had maintained their social status to the end, or perhaps who had been preserved for last because of that status. They had apparently made a final camp, built rough shelters from stones and canvas, and waited for death. Among the artifacts was a pocket watch stopped at 2:20, marking the precise moment when time ended for its owner. Those who continued toward the back river faced an impossible journey. They had to cross Simpson Strait to reach the mainland, then travel hundreds of miles up the river to the nearest Hudson's Bay Company outpost. The strait could only be crossed when frozen solid or by boat when free of ice. In the spring of 1848, it was neither. Broken ice made boat travel impossible, but the ice wasn't solid enough to walk on. They would have had to wait weeks for conditions to change, weeks they didn't have. Some groups apparently made it across to the mainland. Bodies and artifacts found along the back river suggest that some men traveled surprising distances despite their condition. One site, found by later searchers, contained the remains of at least 6 men along with a boat and supplies. They had apparently stopped to rest and never gotten up again. The boat contained bizarre items, books, silverware, silk handkerchiefs, suggesting the lead poisoning was still affecting their judgment to the end. Meanwhile, other groups met their fates around King William Island. One of the most famous discoveries was a boat found on the western shore of the island in 1859. The boat was pointing not south toward escape, but north toward the abandoned ships. Inside were 2 bodies, one of a young man, the other older, possibly an officer based on uniform fragments. The boat also contained chocolate, tea, books, silver cutlery, and inexplicably, silk curtain rods. Were these men trying to return to the ships? Were they waiting for rescue? Or were they so confused by lead poisoning and starvation that they no longer knew which direction led to safety? The books included The Vicar of Wakefield, a novel about maintaining faith through suffering. Perhaps they read to each other as they died, finding comfort in familiar words as the Arctic claimed them. Back in England by 1847, some concern was beginning to develop about Franklin's silence. The expedition had been provisioned for 3 years, so the lack of communication wasn't immediately alarming. But Lady Franklin was growing anxious. She had dreams, she told friends, of her husband trapped in ice, calling for help. She began lobbying for search expeditions, but the Admiralty was reluctant. The expedition wasn't officially overdue yet, and Arctic searches were expensive and dangerous. The first search expeditions were finally authorized in 1848, but they found nothing. The Arctic is vast, larger than the United States, and the searchers had little idea where to look. Franklin could have taken any of a dozen routes through the maze of islands and channels. Ships searched from both the Atlantic and Pacific sides, but the Arctic kept its secrets. Some search expeditions themselves got into trouble, requiring rescue, adding to the growing toll of the Franklin disaster. Lady Franklin became obsessed with finding her husband. She consulted spiritualists who claimed to see Franklin still alive, trapped but surviving. She funded private search expeditions when the Admiralty grew reluctant to spend more money. She became an expert on Arctic geography, proposing search areas, corresponding with explorers, financing rewards for information. Her drawing room became the unofficial headquarters of the Franklin search, maps covering every wall, correspondence piled on every surface. In 1850, the first real clues emerged. Captain Erasmus Omani of HMS Assistance found Franklin's winter quarters on Beechey Island. The discovery of the 3 graves, Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain, with their carefully carved headboards, created more questions than answers. Why only 3 deaths in the first winter? Where had Franklin gone from here? Why were there no messages in the cairns explaining their plans? The graves were examined, but not exhumed at this time. Victorian sensibilities and the frozen ground made exhumation impractical. But the site was thoroughly searched. Hundreds of empty tins were found, scattered around the camp. A pair of gloves, weighted with shot and laid out to dry, suggested someone had left expecting to return. The organization of the site suggested the expedition was still functioning normally when they left. In 1854, Dr. John Ray of the Hudson's Bay Company made the discovery that shocked Victorian Britain. While surveying near Pelly Bay, he encountered Inuit who had artifacts clearly from the Franklin expedition. Silver forks and spoons engraved with officers' initials, buttons from naval uniforms, Franklin's Hanoverian Order of Merit. The Inuit told Ray about encountering white men dragging sledges on King William Island several years earlier, men who were starving and whose ship had been crushed by ice. More shocking were the Inuit reports of finding camps with many dead bodies, showing evidence of cannibalism. They described kettles containing human remains, bones with butcher marks, bodies that had been systematically dismembered. Ray, who had lived in the Arctic for years and trusted Inuit testimony, believed these accounts and included them in his official report. When Ray's report was published in the Times on October 23, 1854, it caused a sensation. Victorian England was horrified. Charles Dickens wrote a furious series of articles refuting Ray's report, arguing that civilized Englishmen would never resort to cannibalism, that the Inuit were either lying or mistaken. The idea that Franklin's men, Royal Navy officers and sailors, Christian gentlemen, had eaten each other was literally unthinkable to Victorian society. Lady Franklin refused to accept Ray's report. She maintained that her husband's men would have died as Christian gentlemen, not savage cannibals. She funded more search expeditions, determined to find evidence that would refute these horrible claims. The British public largely sided with her. It was easier to believe the Inuit were lying than to accept that Englishmen had descended to such barbarism. But the Admiralty used Ray's report as an excuse to declare the Franklin expedition lost with all hands and to end official search efforts. They had spent enormous sums with no survivors found. Britain was now engaged in the Crimean War and needed resources elsewhere. Franklin and his men were officially declared dead on March 31, 1854, their wages stopped, their widows told to remarry. Lady Franklin wouldn't give up. She purchased a steam yacht, the Fox, and hired Captain Leopold McClintock, an experienced Arctic explorer, to conduct one final thorough search of King William Island. The expedition of 1857 to 1859 would finally provide definitive answers about the Franklin expedition's fate. In May 1859, Lieutenant William Hobson, part of McClintock's expedition, found the note at Victory Point with its crucial marginal additions. Finally, they had dates, positions, and confirmation of Franklin's death. The note, water-stained and fragile, had to be carefully dried and preserved. The handwriting in the margins was cramped and showed clear signs of stress. This single piece of paper provided more information about the expedition's fate than all previous searches combined. McClintock's expedition also found the gruesome trail of death along the western and southern shores of King William Island. They found the boat with 2 bodies and its bizarre cargo of books and curtain rods. They found camps with multiple bodies in various states of decomposition. They found personal effects that identified some of the dead, a pocketbook belonging to Harry Pegler, a medicine chest marked with the name of assistant surgeon Alexander MacDonald. One particularly significant find was a collection of papers carried by Harry Pegler, a petty officer from Terra. These papers included what appeared to be an account of the expedition's fate, but written either in code or with spelling so poor, possibly due to lead poisoning affecting cognition, that it remains largely undecipherable. The papers contain tantalizing fragments. "O death, where is thy sting?" and mentions of the dire, dire necessity, but no clear narrative of what happened. McClintock's findings should have ended the mystery, but they only deepened it. Why had Franklin chosen the ice-clogged western route around King William Island when the eastern route was often clear? Why weren't more records left for searchers to find? Where were the ships? Where were most of the bodies? 129 men had sailed north, but only a few dozen bodies had been found. For the next century and a half, various expeditions would search for more clues. The American explorer Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s collected extensive Inuit testimony about the expedition's fate. Frederick Schwatka in 1878 to 1880 conducted a systematic search of King William Island, finding more bodies and artifacts. Each expedition added details to the story, but major questions remained unanswered. The Inuit oral histories, passed down through generations with remarkable accuracy, contained details that wouldn't be confirmed for over a century. They told of 2 ships, one crushed by ice, one that sank in deep water. They described white men who walked strangely, as if drunk, lead poisoning symptoms, whose mouths were black and bleeding, scurvy, who fought among themselves. They preserved exact locations where bodies were found, where artifacts were discovered, where encounters took place. But for decades, these oral histories were dismissed by European authorities as unreliable. The Inuit were seen as primitives, whose testimony couldn't be trusted. Their stories of cannibalism were particularly dismissed as fantasies or misunderstandings. This racist dismissal of indigenous knowledge meant that crucial information about the expedition's fate was ignored for generations. It wasn't until the 1980s that modern scientific techniques began revealing the full truth. Dr. Owen Beechey, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alberta, received permission to exhume the 3 bodies on Beechey Island. What he found shocked the world. The permafrost had perfectly preserved the bodies, creating some of the most haunting images in exploration history. John Torrington, the 20-year-old stoker, looked almost alive after 138 years in the frozen ground. His eyes were partially open, his features intact, his hair still dark. The preservation was so perfect that individual eyelashes were visible. The other 2 bodies were equally well preserved, frozen at the moment of death, their faces showing the strain of their final illness. Analysis of hair and tissue samples revealed catastrophic levels of lead in all 3 bodies. Torrington's lead level was over 600 parts per million. Normal is less than 30. The lead isotope signature matched that used in the solder of the expedition's tinned food. Finally, the mysterious illness that had plagued the expedition from the beginning was explained. They had been slowly poisoned by their own food supply. Further testing of the few surviving tins from the expedition confirmed the problem. Goldner, the provisioner, had used far too much lead solder and had applied it sloppily. Large beads of solder were found on the interior of the tins where they would contact food. Acidic foods like tomatoes and vegetables would have leached even more lead from the solder. Every meal was literally a dose of poison. The search for the ships themselves continued to frustrate explorers for over 160 years. Despite dozens of expeditions using increasingly sophisticated technology, magnetometers, side-scan sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, Erebus and Terror remained hidden. The Canadian government, asserting sovereignty over Arctic waters and seeing the Franklin expedition as part of Canadian heritage, launched major search efforts in the 21st century. Finally, on September 2, 2014, the breakthrough came. A Canadian search expedition found HMS Erebus in just 11 meters of water in eastern Queen Maud Gulf, exactly where Inuit oral history had always said it would be. The ship was remarkably intact, standing upright on the seabed, much of its structure preserved by the cold water. 2 years later, in September 2016, Terror was found in Terror Bay on the south coast of King William Island, again exactly where Inuit oral traditioners had placed it. The ship was in even better condition than Erebus, with masts still standing and many internal features intact. It appeared to have sunk quickly, possibly through ice damage, or perhaps deliberately scuttled by the remnant crew. The discovery of the ships revolutionized understanding of the expedition's end. They were found far south of where they were supposedly abandoned in April 1848, suggesting that some crew members had remanned at least one ship after the initial abandonment. Either the ice had released the ships and a skeleton crew had sailed them south, or they had remained aboard as the ice carried them south, trying to survive as long as possible. Underwater archaeology of the wrecks has revealed extraordinary artifacts. The ship's bell from Erebus was recovered, inscribed with the ship's name and date. Intact cabins have been found with personal possessions still in drawers. Navigation equipment, weapons, dishes, and clothing have been recovered in remarkable condition. In Terror, archaeologists found what appears to be Captain Crozier's cabin largely intact, with maps and documents potentially still readable if they can be properly preserved and restored. Each diving season brings new discoveries and new questions. In 2019, divers recovered epaulets from a lieutenant's uniform, suggesting the owner's body might be nearby. The cold water has preserved organic materials that would normally decay: leather, fabric, paper, and possibly even human remains. The ship's logs, if they still exist in the wrecks, might finally tell the complete story of what happened. Modern climate data has added another dimension to understanding the Franklin disaster. Analysis of ice cores and tree rings shows that 1845 to 1848 were among the coldest years of the entire Little Ice Age. The ice that trapped Franklin's ships was thicker and more extensive than normal. In an average year, they might have escaped. They were victims not just of poor planning and technological failure, but of exceptionally bad timing, sailing into the worst ice conditions in decades. DNA analysis is now being used to identify remains found at various Franklin sites. In 2021, researchers confirmed that remains found at a cannibalism site on King William Island were those of Captain James Fitzjames. The cheerful young officer who had written such optimistic letters home had ended up butchered and consumed by his starving comrades. Other identifications are ongoing, slowly putting names to the bones scattered across King William Island. The Franklin expedition has become a cultural phenomenon far beyond its historical significance. It has inspired countless books, from serious historical accounts to fiction and poetry. The story has been adapted for television, most notably in the AMC series The Terror, which added supernatural elements to an already horrifying true story. The expedition has become a metaphor for hubris, for the limits of technology, for the price of exploration. For Canada, the Franklin expedition has become part of national mythology. The search for Franklin helped establish Canadian sovereignty over the Arctic archipelago. The recent discovery of the ships was explicitly linked to Canadian territorial claims in the Northwest Passage. Franklin failed to navigate the passage, but his failure helped Canada claim ownership of it. For the Inuit, the Franklin story is more complex. Their ancestors' encounters with the dying explorers became part of oral tradition, preserved with remarkable accuracy for over 150 years. The expedition brought useful materials, wood, metal, tools, that improved their material culture. But it also brought disease, disruption, and eventually waves of searchers who had even greater impact on traditional Inuit life. The Franklin sites are now protected as national historic sites, but climate change poses new threats. The permafrost that preserved artifacts and human remains for over 170 years is now melting. Coastal erosion is exposing new sites, but also destroying them. The race is on to find and preserve what remains before the changing Arctic erases the last traces of the expedition. What lessons can we draw from the Franklin expedition? At its most basic level, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence in technology. The expedition had the most advanced equipment of its time: steam engines, heating systems, tinned food. But every innovation failed catastrophically. The steam engines couldn't break through the ice, the heating systems couldn't overcome the cold, and the tinned food slowly poisoned everyone who ate it. It's also a story about the fatal consequences of ignoring indigenous knowledge. The Inuit had survived in the Arctic for thousands of years, but Franklin and his officers dismissed their techniques as primitive. If the expedition had adopted Inuit methods, wearing fur clothing instead of wool, hunting seals for fresh meat, building snow houses for insulation, some might have survived. But Victorian prejudice and naval pride prevented them from learning from the people who actually knew how to survive in the Arctic. The expedition demonstrates the importance of flexibility and adaptation in extreme environments. Franklin's rigid adherence to naval protocol and British social customs proved fatal. Men maintained Victorian-class distinctions while starving to death. They hauled useless luxury items across the ice while dying of scurvy. They followed orders that made no sense rather than adapting to circumstances. But the Franklin expedition is also a testament to human endurance and determination. These men faced unimaginable suffering and kept going long after hope was gone. They maintained enough discipline to bury their dead with dignity, to leave records for future searchers, to attempt an impossible march rather than simply giving up. Even in the face of certain death, some sense of duty and purpose remained. The story raises profound questions about the price of exploration and discovery. Franklin and his men died pursuing a goal that seemed important at the time, but now seems almost trivial. The Northwest Passage they died seeking is now navigable due to climate change, used by cruise ships and cargo vessels. Was their sacrifice worth it? Did their deaths contribute to human progress? Or were they simply victims of imperial ambition and poor planning? Modern Arctic explorers still study the Franklin expedition for lessons. They note how the expedition's strengths became weaknesses. Naval discipline prevented adaptation. Technology created overconfidence. British pride prevented learning from indigenous peoples. They see in Franklin's fate a warning about rigid thinking in environments that demand flexibility. Today, as climate change opens the Arctic to more human activity, Franklin's story becomes newly relevant. The ice that trapped his ships is melting, but the Arctic remains dangerous. Modern technology provides safety margins Franklin couldn't imagine: GPS, satellite phones, emergency beacons, aircraft rescue. But technology can still fail. The Arctic still demands respect, still punishes hubris, still swallows the unprepared. Standing on the shore of King William Island today, you can still find traces of the Franklin expedition. Scattered bones bleached white by the sun, fragments of wood and metal, buttons and bits of fabric. The cairns built by Franklin's men and their searchers still stand, though many have been damaged by weather and time. The graves on Beechey Island are maintained as a memorial, visited by cruise ships whose passengers stand in silence before the weathered headboards. But the real memorial to Franklin's expedition is less tangible. It's the knowledge gained from their failure, the maps drawn by those who searched for them, the respect for indigenous knowledge that their death eventually taught. It's the understanding that exploration demands not just courage and technology, but wisdom, adaptability, and humility before the forces of nature. The Franklin expedition sailed into the Arctic believing they would conquer it through British determination and modern technology. Instead, the Arctic conquered them completely. But in their failure, they achieved a different kind of success. They became part of the ongoing human story of exploration, a chapter that teaches through tragedy what success alone cannot convey. Every generation rediscovers Franklin and reinterprets his story through the lens of contemporary concerns. To the Victorians, he was a Christian hero who died nobly for science and country. To the modern era, he often represents colonial arrogance meeting environmental reality. Future generations will undoubtedly find their own meanings in his story, their own lessons in his fate. The search for Franklin continues in various forms even today. Archaeologists still work on the wrecks, carefully documenting and recovering artifacts. Historians pore over documents in archives, finding new connections and insights. Scientists analyze recovered materials with ever more sophisticated techniques. Each discovery adds nuance to our understanding, though the essential story remains unchanged. 129 men sailed into the Arctic and vanished, victims of environment, technology, and their own limitations. The Arctic has yielded many of its Franklin secrets, but not all. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, there are still bodies unfound, documents unread, stories untold. The ship's logs might be preserved in the captain's cabins, protected by the cold water. Personal journals might lie frozen in the permafrost, waiting for discovery. Or they might have been destroyed by time, ice, and the desperate men who might have burned them for a few moments of warmth. In the end, the Franklin expedition asks fundamental questions about human nature and ambition. What drives us to risk everything for discovery? How do we balance progress with prudence? When do we admit defeat, and when do we persevere? These questions resonated with the Victorians who sent Franklin north, resonate with us today as we push into new frontiers. and will resonate with future generations facing their own unknown territories. The Franklin expedition stands as one of history's great cautionary tales, but also as one of its great adventures. It warns against hubris while celebrating courage. It demonstrates the power of nature while honoring human determination. It shows the worst of what can happen when everything goes wrong, but also reveals the best of human endurance under impossible circumstances. The ice remembers everything. In the cold waters of Queen Maud Gulf and Terror Bay, Erebus and Terror rest on the seabed, slowly releasing their secrets. On King William Island, bones and artifacts emerge from the melting permafrost each summer, fragments of lives cut short. In museums and archives, recovered items tell their silent stories. A pocket watch stopped forever at 2:20, a silk handkerchief embroidered with initials, a spoon engraved with a family crest whose line died in the Arctic. Franklin and his men sought the Northwest Passage and found instead a different kind of passage. From life into legend, from history into myth, from failure into a strange kind of immortality. They are sailing still in our collective imagination, forever trapped in ice, forever walking across frozen wastes, forever embodying both the glory and folly of exploration. Their story reminds us that some frontiers extract a terrible price, that nature cannot be conquered, only endured, that technology without wisdom is a fatal combination. But it also reminds us that humans will always push beyond the safe and known, that some goals are worth pursuing even if they lead to disaster, that in our failures we sometimes achieve our greatest triumphs. The Franklin expedition failed in its stated mission, but succeeded in becoming eternal. Not the eternity Franklin sought, fame as the discoverer of the Northwest Passage, but a darker, more complex eternity as both warning and inspiration. They sailed beyond the edge of the map and became themselves a map, a chart of human endurance, suffering, and determination that explorers have followed ever since. 129 men entered the Arctic in 1845. None came home, but in a sense they never left. They remain in the Arctic ice and snow, in Inuit memory and Canadian identity, in British naval tradition and human imagination. They failed to find the Northwest Passage, but became themselves a passage, through time, through suffering, through the extremes of human experience. This is their monument, not stone and bronze, but story and memory, not geographical discovery, but human truth. They sailed into white silence and speak to us still across nearly 2 centuries. They vanished into Arctic ice and remain visible forever in the lessons they teach. They failed in their mission and succeeded in becoming legend. The Franklin expedition, Sir John Franklin and his 128 men who sailed north with such confidence and never returned, who sought glory and found horror, who trusted in technology and died when it failed them, who maintained their British identity to the end even as it killed them. Their story is both uniquely of its time and timeless, both a specific historical tragedy and a universal human drama. As climate change transforms the Arctic, they died trying to navigate. As the Northwest Passage they sought becomes a routine shipping lane, as technology advances beyond anything they could have imagined, their story remains relevant. It reminds us that nature always has the last word, that hubris is always punished, that the unknown always demands respect. Somewhere in the Arctic, the wind still howls across King William Island, carrying whispers of the past. Somewhere in the cold waters, Erebus and Terror wait patiently to reveal their remaining secrets. Somewhere in archives and museums, artifacts wait to tell their stories to those who know how to listen. The Franklin expedition is ended, but never over, solved, but eternally mysterious, found but forever lost in the white silence of the Arctic. They sailed into legend and remain there still. Franklin and Crozier, Fitzjames and Gore, Torrington and Pegler, and all the others whose names we know and don't know. They sought the Northwest Passage and found instead a passage through death into immortality, through failure into meaning, through suffering into the eternal human story of exploration and endurance. The Arctic claimed them, but we claim them back through memory and meaning. They belong to the ice, but they also belong to us, part of our heritage as a species that explores, that pushes boundaries, that refuses to accept limits even when accepting them would mean survival. Their failure is our warning. Their courage is our inspiration. Their fate is our reminder that some prices are too high to pay, but someone will always be willing to pay them. This is the complete story of the Franklin expedition, not just a tale of ships trapped in ice, but a complex human drama of ambition and failure, technology and nature, civilization and wilderness, order and chaos, life and death. It's a story that began with champagne toasts in London and ended with cannibalism on King William Island, a story that warns us about the dangers of exploration while celebrating the human drive to explore. They sailed north toward glory and found death. They trusted in progress and died when progress failed them. They believed in British superiority and learned that the Arctic recognizes no superiority but its own. They maintained civilization until civilization became impossible, then descended into barbarism they couldn't have imagined. They died badly, but they also died magnificently, pushing themselves beyond all reasonable limits in pursuit of an impossible goal. The Franklin expedition reminds us that exploration has always been dangerous, that the unknown demands sacrifice, that progress comes at a price that someone must pay. Franklin and his men paid that price in full. They gave their lives for a few hundred miles of mapped coastline, for lessons learned through failure, for a place in the eternal story of human ambition and endurance. As long as humans venture into unknown places, as long as we push against the boundaries of the possible, as long as we risk everything for knowledge and glory, the Franklin expedition will remain relevant. They are our cautionary tale and our inspiration, our warning and our challenge. They remind us of the price of discovery and dare us to decide if we're willing to pay it. The Arctic ice is melting now, the Northwest Passage opening, the frozen wilderness that killed Franklin's men retreating before climate change. But the Arctic remains dangerous, remains indifferent to human ambition, remains ready to claim those who don't respect its power. Franklin's ghosts still walk the ice, still sail the dark waters, still whisper their warnings to those who will listen. They are there forever. 129 men who sailed north and never returned, who sought the Northwest Passage and found death, who became themselves a passage through human experience that every explorer since has traveled. They failed and succeeded, died and became immortal, vanished and remain eternally present in the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're willing to sacrifice for discovery. The Franklin expedition ended but never finished, solved but eternally mysterious, a tragedy that became triumph, a failure that became legend. They sailed into the Arctic and never returned, but in never returning, they achieved the immortality they sought, not as conquerors of the Northwest Passage, but as eternal symbols of human ambition, endurance, and the terrible price of pushing beyond the edge of the world. Thanks for joining me on this complete examination of one of history's most haunting maritime disasters. The Franklin expedition reminds us that the unknown always demands respect, that technology without wisdom is fatal, and that some mysteries are solved only through tragedy. If you found this deep dive into Arctic exploration compelling, make sure to subscribe to Michael's Expeditions for more incredible journeys into history's most fascinating adventures and mysteries. Until next time, remember that the edge of the map is always closer than we think, and some who cross it never return.